Yeah, thank you, Mano, for this kind introduction, and thank you, Julia and Edita, for breaking the way. I mean, because it connects a lot with what you said, what I'm starting to present. So I would like to start my presentation with a quote by Hannah Arendt to get an understanding of how a great number of people were situated after the collapse of the vast multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I. So this is a quote from The Origins of Totalitarianism from 1951, so a little bit different from the time I'm speaking about. And there she writes about this interwar period from a, let's say, analytical standpoint. The calamity of the rightless is not that they are deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or of equality before the law and freedom of opinion, formulas which were designed to solve problems within given communities, but that they are no longer belong to any community whatsoever. Their plight is not that they are not equal before the law, but that no law exists for them, not that they are oppressed, but that nobody wants even to oppress them. End of quote. And I agree with Julia's assessment that Hannah Arendt did not appreciate, let's say, the work which was done, let's say, grassroots like Mandelstam's or Nansen's, or as we saw in Edita's talk about women and children in international law. But I think what Arendt did understood is what the situation was like. And so, and I think this quote somehow mirrors that. So to give you a number, from 1926, there was an estimation of 9.5 million people moving as refugees or as refugees in Europe. 1/3 of them could be defined as statelessness. With the founding of the League of Nations in 1920, Edita talked about this. This was the plan to settle international disputes through negotiation and arbitration. But this organization was not really prepared for the vast humanitarian and refugee crisis in the interwar period. So how did the international community cope with so many people in need and plight of statelessness? As we will see, this era was shaped by a melange of pragmatism, tentative models of aid and chagrin felt by many humanitarians. And so far, this is the other side, the humanitarian side of the interwar period coin Rolf Hosfeld described in his keynote. And by the same token, one could argue that this side was as crooked as the one characterized by the interplay of violence and modernity. And all these aspects I talked about can be studied, I think, vicariously through the life of the Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen, whose story I would like to tell this morning in 4 parts. So the first part is a little bit of biographical background, because I don't know how much the audience in the live stream and you here at the European Academy know about this. And then I will move to this Nansen certificate and discuss this a little bit. Then about the population exchange, we already discussed a little bit with Julia between Greece and Turkey. And at last, his engagement in the Armenian Question. But I can promise you it's not a very happy ending. So I will start with Nansen. Nansen was both, you can see him here, both an intellectual man and a man of action. He was renowned in his days as an Arctic explorer, zoologist, oceanographer, and diplomat. Before he became the High Commissioner for Refugees for the League of Nations in 1921, Nansen already embodied the dreams of his era, the aspiration to explore, study, and bringing nations forward through a progressive scientific way of thinking. He was a public, almost heroic figure. The British writer and pacifist Vera Brittain once called him, I quote, a hero of every school child. And I mean, you can see the pictures here. The left one is from the 1890s. The dynamic Norwegian who conquered the Arctic like this, and he also wrote books about it, and he was a public figure in Europe. That's why Vera Brittain called him a hero of every schoolchild. And on the right side, the right picture, this is a picture of Nansen in his years as a High Commissioner. But this was only 10 years. I mean, he died 1930, so the 10 years. But what did he do before? So Nansen earned his first diplomatic merits as an ambassador in London from 1906 to 1908. One of the main tasks was to negotiate a treaty with the other European representatives to guarantee Northern's sovereignty. The background is that Norway and Sweden were one union since 1814, and 1905 there was a separation process going on, and Nansen negotiated this in London. And during this time in London, Nansen saw himself more as an explorer and scientist than as a politician. He was always, in this era, he said, nah, it's a little bit dull to be a diplomat, it has to be done, but what we know from his diaries and from other sources, he mainly visited the Royal Observatory in London and did his scientific work. So not the full-blooded diplomat we maybe see him later on. And this changes, I think, with World War I, which he referred to as, I quote, "the greatest confession of defeat of humanity, the bitter fruits of which mankind must eat for a generation." So this is something I think he shared with a lot of people, but this is also some, let's say, personal experience which changed things. So his first humanitarian engagement was actually in Norway itself. Due to the blockade of important international trade routes during World War I, famine threatened Scandinavia. After months of negotiations in Washington, Nansen, as a special ambassador, arranged for the USA to provide grain and other supplies. During the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, Nansen was an observer and lobbied for the recognition of the rights of small states. Also with in mind that Norway as a small state could be, let's say, a diplomatic player on the global scale. He became the president of the League of Nations Society in Norway and advocated Norway's membership in the League of Nations, which was effectuated in 1920. In the spring of 1920, Nansen was appointed by the League of Nations to set up relief plans for prisoners of war and to expedite repatriation of two groups, Russians still in Germany and prisoners of war from the Central Powers in Siberia. He had to learn about, coordinate, and encourage the work already accomplished on their behalf by governments and organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and the regularly report to the Council. Nearly 400,000 prisoners of war from 26 different nationalities were finally repatriated in the less than 2 years. Interesting was that Nansen was received in Moscow with open arms because he was this public figure. He was seen as this explorer he was, and so not as the, let's say, the diplomat from the League of Nations, because, I mean, as you know, there were tensions in this time between communist and anti-communist political levels. And he was, let's say, able to swim through the sharky waters of this, let's say, diplomatic surroundings. And this was always not easy because, of course, the League, some people from the League, they also said, yeah, why are you communicating or talking with the Bolsheviks and later with the Soviets as well? So this was, it was between the sheets, if you so will. Yeah. But after the success of the prisoner of war exchange, he was asked by the League to fill the new position of a High Commissioner for Refugees in 1921. The idea to have a responsible person in the League to coordinate, centralize with individual governments, voluntary agencies, and private individuals was quite new, but one should not assume that this position was particularly lavishly endowed. No money was spent on direct relief work. Only administration costs were covered. So that means for the direct relief work, this had to be raised by, from private individuals or channeled off in cooperation with other institutions like the International Red Cross. His main brief in this time was the resettlement of around 2 million Russian refugees displaced by the upheavals of the Russian Revolution. At the same time, he tried to tackle the famine in Russia. 30 million people suffered, which only succeeded partly through NGOs like the IRC, due to no support by the countries of the League because of this anti-communist standing. The Realpolitik, the real politics of Western nations against the Bolsheviks and later Soviets, disappointed Nansen and let him dashingly reply his well-known sentence, "Charity is Realpolitik." So charity is real politics. So you can see this is a picture from refugees which were saved through the Nansen office and the International Red Cross. And what I found very interesting is that this kind of charity is Realpolitik connects with the work of Johannes Lepsius, because I mean he saw his involvement in the Armenian reform program in 1913 as a triumph of Realpolitik, real politics based on ethical grounds instead of imperialistic grounds. So we have the same, let's say, moral language here from Nansen, which we also can find Lepsius, also Mandelstam, I guess. So this is a interesting connection, and the next connection with Lepsius is, of course, also both were bitterly disillusioned because the reform program of Lepsius in 1913 did not work out because of World War I and then the Armenian genocide. And Nansen had a similar experience, as we will see at the end of the presentation. If one compares the efforts of the American Relief Administration, the ARA, and the Nansen team, as historian Karl Emil Vogt has convincingly shown, the ARA mobilized more money to fight the famine. One must maybe say that the US was not part of the League of Nations. I mean, from the official side, just the observer status. So there was also, let's say, a fight about who is the better humanitarian or not, and what reasons are behind this. The idea in 1921 was not only to stem, and this is from the side of the US now, which Karl Emil Vogt worked out, the idea in 1921 was not only to stem the tide of communism, but also to enter Russia, the heart of the communist threat to the world, with vast quantities of aid to undermine and eventually overthrow the regime. American policymakers believed that an effective response to grievances of the Russian people would remove any reason to support the Bolsheviks, and that a liberal regime could be established. As President Woodrow Wilson told the Congress in 1919, I quote, "Bolshevism is advancing steadily westward and poisoning Germany. It cannot be stopped by force, but it can be stopped by food," end of quote. So what we see here, I mean, the US gives more money to fight the famine, to destabilize the Bolsheviks. Anti-communist stance, and the League of Nations does not give enough money because of the general anti-communist stance. So it's also a little bit an awkward situation, and I leave it by that without commenting further. I think we can all agree that it's a complexity of reality. One main problem, so that's the second point, the Nansen Passport. One main problem in the humanitarian efforts for the refugees was the legal status without documentation. This takes up Arendt's quote. Before 1914, traveling through Europe had been relatively liberal without many constraints. So there are a lot of proofs about this. I remember Stefan Zweig, the writer, in Die Welt von gestern, The Words of Yesterday, where he describes the pre-World War I era as an era where you can travel from India to Berlin without any documents and passports, and this there's a change after World War I. After World War I changes this open atmosphere dramatically due to implementing restrictive legislation requiring passports and visas. So how could the Russian refugees travel to other countries? Nansen discussed this issue with diplomats and legal scholars on a few international conferences and introduced in 1922 a simple and radical way which became known as the Nansen Passport. So you can see the pictures. I will talk a little bit about this. After it had initially been invented exclusively for Russian stateless persons, the League of Nations conferences successively extended the international recognized identification and travel document to other groups, always defined according their national, their ethnic origin. Armenian refugees in 24, in 28, Assyrians and Assyro-Chaldeans, and later on it applied to survivors of genocide and expulsion in the Middle East, and in the 30s also Jewish refugees from National Socialism, so from the Saarland in 35-6 and in 38 from Germany and Austria. This first refugee card in the world was developed for stateless refugees in the face of the Russian Revolution at their places of exile or stopovers, primarily in Western, Central and Eastern Europe, South America, and the Far East, China and Shanghai. They thus formed the original group of political refugees of the 20th century. The certificate was a substitute identity card for undocumented people that authenticated their identity of origin instead of home authority, and at the same time created a substitute identity as a refugee in a new homeland. The group of eligible holders, and this was called persons of Russian origin who had not acquired a new nationality, formed the first refugee definition according to a case-based, collective and nationally defined concept of refugee. The actual situation, statelessness, remained unspoken with regard to the bearers and did its course in the aggression of states against undesirable population groups. So what we have here is this collective, nationally defined concept of a refugee. So that's why they always talk about the Russian refugees, the Armenian refugees, the Assyrian refugees. So this idea of a refugee we have today, this is a whole other concept. So there's a group-based concept. It's not a individual concept. And this changes then, of course, after 45 and with some development in international law in 51, where this kind of, let's say, refugee in an individual sense is born as an abstract definition. I mean, it's the people, but on the legal level. However, the special document for stateless refugees was by no means accessible to all stateless persons, not even to all refugees among them. About 100,000 stateless persons in the successor states of the Habsburg Empire, especially Hungarians, Austrians, Ruthenians, Jews, or those affected by the German-Polish border shifts, remain excluded. Neither the intergovernmental conferences of the League of Nations nor the assemblies for the codification of international law could bring themselves to generalize the model status for all those affected or even to outlaw statelessness, as international lawyers, minority representatives, and humanitarian actors had been demanding since the beginning of the 1920s. Statelessness as a contemporary mass phenomenon and political problem was not solved in this way, contrary to what was hoped for at the time and is still widely assumed today. So this certificate, and you can see here two of them. One, the left one is from 1927, a woman from Belarus. And the right one is from, let me see, I cannot see the pictures right good. It's from 1938, so a little bit later. So these certificates, they were issued until 1939. And the other one is for a Russian grocer who lived in Leipzig. And you can see that, I mean, from a source standpoint, you can see the pictures, and then there's of course the description, the hair color, how the nose looked like is also a little bit awkward, but so all these kind of ethnic characteristics they thought there were this times. But I want to warn you, because this certificate was not an international or even universal passport or permit as we know today. You know? So it's maybe a predecessor, but it's not similar to what we know today. And about the numbers, it's a little bit complicated. I mean, in the archives, League of Nations in Geneva, there's a number of issued a total of 450,000 passports, but there are also some sources, some reports in the early 30s from members of the Nansen team who say there were up to 800,000 passports issued. This is a large number. I mean, compared to the, let's say, 9.6 million I referred before, it's not the biggest part, but it's a big number, and I think we can say that this Nansen Passport was a success story in this time. Nevertheless, the practical effects, I mean, nevertheless, in case of that it was not a universal passport, the practical effects of these kind of certificates were decisive. Proof of identity, of course, made it possible to find housing, also work. It was a necessary prerequisite for the bureaucratic side of a civic life, with marriage, the acquisition of property, and so on. Formalized refugee status entitled people to assistance from aid organizations or state bodies in some European countries, but required repeated certification at short intervals. It subjected the holders to grueling bureaucratic harassment, often experienced as humiliating or arbitrary. The writer, Vladimir Nabokov, remembers the Nansen certificate as a, I quote, highly inferior document of sickly green color. Its holder was a little more than a parole criminal, end of quote. So this is you see the green on the right side. Nabokov was one famous person. The other one, you know, Marc Chagall had a Nansen certificate. Igor Stravinsky had a Nansen certificate. So, and after 1 year, the certificate had to be renewed. It did not mean secure asylum status, but it formally, not necessarily factually, protected against deportation and was the requirement for the individual visas that had to be obtained each time a person crossed the border, for which it served as a supporting document. Before return visas were permitted in 1926, however, holders often did not dare to cross the border for fear of losing their country of refuge after their homeland. So that means you couldn't go back to the land where or to the country where the Nansen certificate was issued. That changed after in 26. So the Nansen passports, or the certificates you see here, they are already with the possibility that you can go back. But there is it's too small. But I mean, if you look up this kind of passports on the internet, there are a lot of sources. You can always read this kind of restriction. Oops. The restriction. Why is the the restriction here that you cannot go back? So this was something which was a problem, of course. I mean, because the mobility was somehow restrained. Nevertheless, the Nansen refugees were considered privileged, and Hannah Arendt sarcastically referred to them as the aristocracy among the stateless people. At the same time, the novel document aroused hope, as documented by numerous letters of request for the insurance of the League of Nations passport in the archives of the League of Nations. So in the archives of the League of Nations, you can find 100,000 of letters from people who want a Nansen certificate, but who are not able to get it because of the of the rules they had. And this is interesting because that tells us that the Nansen certificate was something everyone wanted. It was an important document. So to sum up, the Nansen certificate was an internationally negotiated technical bureaucratic response to the new kinds of political aggression against vulnerable populations, documenting identity, the origin, instead of home country, and establishing a new identity as a refugee. It can be interpreted as an attempt at normalization by means of provisional arrangement. The document which was supposed to enable the mobility of stateless groups through their repatriation or naturalization to a country of refuge, actually created a substitute identity as a stateless person. So now I will come to the third part, the Greco-Turkish War and the involvement of Nansen's bureau in this kind. The end of the Greco-Turkish War in 1922 brought about with the defeat of the Greek army by the Turks and the fire of Smyrna that destroyed much of the city in September 1922, occurred while the Russian refugee question was still far from being settled. So we also have this kind of ongoing process. You know, it's the new refugees, the new stateless persons appear there. So this was whole Europe, if you so will, the fire of refugees going on. On September 19, the League's Assembly authorized Nansen to use the services of the Russian Refugee Organization to provide assistance for the relief of refugees from the Near East and to administer the money collected for this purpose. The Greek government gave Nansen full powers to proceed with negotiations for the exchange of prisoners of war and detained civilians between Greece and Turkey. In addition, thanks to the backing of the Allied High Commissioners who had administered the city of Constantinople after the general armistice of November 1918, he negotiated the terms of the reciprocal exchange of populations. The question then became part of the peace negotiations in Lausanne, as we heard. Nansen and the leader of the Greek delegation, Eleftherios Venizelos, concurred on the necessity of making an exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey compulsory. Nansen left on an investigative trip to the Near East, accompanied by Noel Baker and Arthur Sautler, head of the League of Nations financial section. In October, while in Athens, he proposed to a head of foreign and international organizations under a centralized coordination committee. The latter did not become operational as such, but turned out to be a clearinghouse for information through the publication of an information bulletin. In November, Nansen and his staff established a mission in Western Thrace, which relieved and resettled 10,000 refugees. The population exchange was seen, from the perspective of Nansen and the League of Nations, as the best form of minority protection, as well as the, I quote, the most radical and human remedy, end of quote, of all. Nansen believed that what was on the negotiating table at Lausanne was no ethno-nationalism, but rather a question that demanded quick and an efficient resolution without a minimum of delay. So there I only can connect with Julia that this kind of political, let's say, view was quite naive. I mean, this is what we can say today. He believed that economic component of the problem of Greek and Turkish refugees deserves the most attention. I quote Nansen, "Such an exchange will provide Turkey immediately and in the best conditions with the population necessary to continue the exploitation of the cultivated lands which the departed Greek populations have abandoned. The departure from Greece and its Muslim citizens would create the possibility of rendering self-supporting a great proportion of the refugees now concentrated in the towns and in different parts of Greece." End of quote. Nansen recognized that the difficulties were truly immense, acknowledging that the population exchange would require, I quote Nansen, "the displacement of populations of any more than 1 million people," end of quote. He advocated uprooting these people from their homes, transferring to a new country, registering, valuing, liquidating their individual property which they abandoned, and securing them to the payment of their just claims to the value of this property. I mean, from a research standpoint today, we say this forced population exchange was a kind of ethnic cleansing, and I think we can all agree with that. But what was more, let's say, pressing is that this kind of official way of exchanging populations somehow differed in a kind of policy making, which is, I think, not what Nansen really wanted. I mean, from the writings we know, he somehow he saw the humanitarian crisis, and then we have to act. So this is the thinking, but this is of course also naive. I mean, if he doesn't see the political, let's say, ethno-nationalist view behind it. And I think one can argue that Nansen somehow felt this. I mean, we don't know it from his writings, or I don't know anything from his writings where he says, yeah, maybe it was wrong or it was not the best case. But I think we can maybe go to the Armenian question and then see how he reacts there. And this reaction maybe could be, it's a speculative, but it could be connected with his disappointment and maybe seeing his failure in the Greece-Turkish population exchange. In August, so that's my last part, in August 1923, Gabriel Nouradungian, president of the Armenian National Delegation, addressed 2 letters to the League's Council, reporting the conditions of post-genocide Armenians and asking for the extension of Nansen's mandate to this group. Nansen formulated 2 plans for the settlement of Armenian refugees to Soviet Armenia and Syria. On September 25th, 1924, the Council passed a resolution asking the High Commissioner and the International Labour Organization to make a formal inquiry into the possibilities of creating an Armenian settlement plan in the Caucasus. 2 days later, Nansen convened a conference in Geneva where it was stated that 300,000 Russian and 200,000 Armenian refugees still needed to be settled. Although repatriation was considered to be the best solution, the opposition of Soviet and Turkish authorities made it almost impossible. Also fighting against the unwillingness of some within the League of Nations circles to end its involvement in the refugee questions, Nansen held private negotiations with the ILO director Albert Thomas in the spring of 1924, because Nansen believed that employment was central to the solution of the refugee problem or question. So his idea was, this is also something new, that it's not only that people, let's say, being saved and fed and clothed, but that they also have this kind of opportunity to work in economic status for themselves. And with this International Labour Organization, there was a close cooperation and they, for example, they gave loans to refugees to open up their own businesses and shops. So this is something which is quite new, and I think is also different from what we know from the humanitarian aid at the end of the 19th century, with a more missionary, let's say, standpoint. While Nansen continued with political negotiations and issues connected with the Nansen Passport, the ILO began to find employment for refugees. In line with Nansen's mandate, the ILO would not provide direct relief to refugees, and the organization's involvement was to be temporary. Nansen visited Armenia and proposed a settlement scheme for a modest plan for an area for refugees could be settled. The League created a commission for the settlement of Armenian refugees. However, this body did not produce any concrete results, and the proposed settlement scheme was abandoned mainly because there was no interest by the countries of the League of Nations to endow migration into the Soviet Union, and no one was willing to provide the funds for Nansen's plan. Even Nansen, no, not even Nansen, what he did is that he could settle 10,000 Armenians in Yerevan and 40,000 Armenians in Lebanon. But I mean, we talked about 200,000, and these are the only ones who accounted for, maybe more. Looking back at this last years of his life, Nansen described the full force of Realpolitik, in a bad way, the Realpolitik, the imperialistic Realpolitik, regarding the Armenians in his comprehensive book, Armenia and the Near East, which is not only an homage to the Armenian culture, but also a bitter analysis of the Armenian question, which connects from Lepsius' early works after the Armenian massacres, as well to aspects we discussed at this conference. So let me close my presentation, not very pleasant, with Nansen's own judgment. We have seen that the Western powers of Europe and the United States of America have given words and nothing else, by way of fulfilling the promise to the Armenian people which they had made with such solemnity when they needed support in war. The nations of Europe and the statesmen of Europe are tired of the everlasting Armenian question, of course. And after all, it was only a massacred but gifted little nation with no oil fields or gold mines. Woe to the Armenian people that they were ever drawn into the European politics. It would have been better for them if the name Armenia had never been uttered by any European diplomats. But the Armenian people have never abandoned hope. They have gone on bravely working and waiting. Waiting year after year, they are waiting still. Thank you for your attention.